Okay, let's talk about the idea of the Ushpizin, the 7 biblical guests that we invite into our Sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot. The first night being Abraham, the second Isaac, the third is Jacob, the fourth Moses, then Aaron, then Joseph, then David. These are the 7. Although that order, there are a couple of different ways to do. One order is chronologically, which actually would place Joseph before Moses and Aaron, but the way I'm going to speak about it is the order of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who founded one of the major systems of Kabbalah. It's the Kabbalistic order, which, as we'll talk about, isn't necessarily so mystical. But here's the questions that I want to pose. One is, what do we mean by inviting these people into the Sukkah? Are we talking about some kind of ghosts? Are we talking about paranormal phenomenon? Second question is, why these 7 in particular? What about Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel? How about Judah? Any number of other people that we could think about inviting in. So let's talk about that. The first part of the answer has to do with the fact that it's not really 3 festival holidays, but 4. We typically think about Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot as the 3 festival holidays. But in fact, it's Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret. It's 2 major cycles, each with 2 holidays. The first cycle is the Pesach Shavuot cycle. We start with Pesach, and then 49 days later we have Shavuot. The second one is the Sukkot cycle, where 8 days later we have Shmini Atzeret. So in Pesach you have 7 weeks. Then at the beginning of the 8th week you have Shavuot. And on the other side of the year you have a much more compacted version of that, where you have 7 days, and then on the 8th day you have Shmini Atzeret, that festival. But the reason that we usually think about it as 3 is the fact that there are 3 pilgrimages. You have Pesach, you have to go to Jerusalem. Then 49 days later on Shavuot you go to Jerusalem, and then on Sukkot you go to Jerusalem. It's just that you don't go to Jerusalem on Shmini Atzeret because you're already there. So that's why it's usually thought about in terms of 3 instead of 4, but in fact it's 4. The Ramban, the 13th century major Torah commentator, discusses this. He talks about the fact that Sukkot, you have the first holiday Yom Tov, followed by 6 intervening days called Chol HaMoed, and he says it's really the same thing with Pesach, where the first holiday, the Yom Tov, is followed by 49 days until Shavuot, and that 49 days is a sort of a Chol HaMoed. It's sort of an intervening time of that wider holiday period. So really we're talking about 2 cycles that are in parallel. Okay. In the cycle of Pesach to Shavuot, we have a period that is called Sefirat Ha-Omer, the counting of the Omer. In that period, while we're counting, we recognize that each of these days as having a correspondence in the Sfirot. Without getting into that concept so much, just suffice it to call them qualities. We're talking about different qualities that are associated with each of the weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, and also each of the days within the weeks. So, for example, day 10 of the Omer would be the first week and the 3rd day. The first quality, the first sfirah in this group of 7 is chesed, which means kindness, but also in a more conceptual way means expansiveness, openness, and so the first week would be the week of Chesed, and the 3rd day is Tiferet, which has a different meaning. I'll get into the meanings in a moment. But just suffice it to understand that each of the days between Pesach and Shavuot corresponds to a Sefira, which is the same thing actually in in the Sukkot cycle. Each of the days of Sukkot also corresponds to a Sefira. It's just that instead of being this expanded cycle that has weeks and days, 7 times 7, this is compacted just 7. So we talk about guests instead of Sefirot. We use that language because we've essentially created this space. We've built a space, and it's nice to the idea of inviting somebody into the space. But in fact, and now this gets into the reason of why these 7 guests, these 7 Ushpizin in particular, not anybody else, because the same Kabbalah system that discusses the Sefirot also makes a correspondence between each of the Sefirot and these 7 people in particular. So when we talk about inviting these 7 in, what we're really saying is we're talking about the Sefirot. We're talking about these qualities that we're inviting in. And essentially, it's a time just as the Sefirat Ha-Omer is considered to be a time of tikkun hamidot, of working on one's own qualities and trying to incorporate the quality, think about how it applies to one's own life. It's the same thing, really, in the Sukkot cycle. It's just that we use the names of biblical figures, but they're placeholders for these qualities. So let's talk about what these qualities actually are. So the 7, we talked about the 7 biblical figures. Now we'll talk about it in terms of the qualities. The first day, Abraham, corresponds to Chesed, which, as I alluded to, has to do with this expansiveness and magnanimousness, this openness and willing to give without borders. That's the first day, and that's something that is a way of, that's a dimension of ourselves that we want to consider, we want to work on, we want to bring out at times that are appropriate, to give without borders, not to be thinking about withholding, which is a segue into the next one. The next day, Isaac is corresponded to the Sefira of Gevura. Gevura means strength, but the more conceptual definition of that has to do with withholding and restraining, creating borders. It's about more of an inward look than an outward expansion. And there's a time for that as well. There's a time to think about setting up borders. There's a time to go inward and not be so outwardly focused. And that's another midah. It's another characteristic or aspect of ourselves that we want to incorporate. The third day is Jacob, who corresponds to the Sefira of Tiferet. Tiferet can mean splendor or beauty, but in the more conceptual concept, it has to do with a balance between Chesed and Gevurah. It has to do with balancing the idea of being outward and expansive and being inward and restricting. It's balancing giving and withholding. And that's something that we have to do all the time. That's a work in and of itself, is just figuring out how to balance these two in a healthy way. Okay, so then the fourth night is Moses, and Moses corresponds to the Sefira of Netzach. Netzach means dominance. It means overpowering. It means making one's will felt. It means influencing the world. That's something, obviously, that's necessary to do in life. We have to have our will and our desires made manifest and communicate those. This fifth night is Aaron, and Aaron corresponds to the Sefira of Hod. Hod is the opposite of that. So again, we had a sort of a triad of Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet. Now we're having where Chesed and Gevurah are the opposite, and Tiferet is the balance between the two. Now we're having a second triad. The second triad has Netzach on the one side, dominance, and then you have the opposite Hod. Hod is the opposite of dominating. It's deferring. It's not making one's will felt, but actually accepting somebody else's will. It's allowing someone else to lead. It's being not necessarily submissive, but willfully letting somebody else be the influence. That's Hod. The balance of that is Yesod. Yesod is the sixth night. That's associated with Joseph. Yesod is balancing those two things. We're constantly doing in life and in relationships, trying to figure out when we should make a point of it, and when we should make our will felt, when we should be trying to influence the situation, or when we kind of sit back and let somebody else be the influencer. That's one of the major points in any close relationship is striking that balance. And again, that's its own work, and it's its own sefirah, it's its own quality. Now, the seventh and final day of Sukkot, the seventh and final sefirah, quality, and the seventh and final guest. David is the last guest. Malchut is the sefirah or quality that's associated with David. Malchut means kingship or reign, and David, of course, is the king. But on a more conceptual level, Malchut, in terms of the sefirot, in terms of these qualities, has to do with not so much any particular work, but is the result of all the work that we've done put together. Malchut is associated with Shabbat. Shabbat is a time where, we have 6 days, just like we have 6 sefirot, and then Malchut. We have 6 days of the week, and then Shabbat. The 6 days of the week are the time that we put in all our work and all our effort, and the 7th day is the day where we reap the fruits of that effort, where we sit back and we enjoy it, where we have Ohr HaShachar, it's called, where we exude light and joy just being. It's not such a day of doing, but being. And that itself is a type of work. It's not necessarily so easy to stop doing. Just being requires its own tikkun hamidot, its own internal work. And that's the idea of Malchut. So when you put all of these together, from Abraham through David, Chesed through Malchut, you have a whole range of experiences, a whole range of ways of being in the world that we have to think about balancing. We have to think about incorporating within us. And that's really the idea of the Ushpizin. When we're talking about inviting them into the Sukkah, really what we mean is we're inviting or incorporating these very central aspects of life into ourselves in a positive way.